Justin, could you just start by introducing yourself, telling us a little bit about who you are and the name of this piece?
So I'm Justin Emmanuel Dumas. I'm born and raised in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The title of this show is GoodBones. And as we'll get into, there are lots of found objects and materials, many of which I think are definitely native to the city and represent the history of kind of economic activity in Pittsburgh.
Cool. Could you tell us what inspired the installation?
Absolutely. So the initial prompt around ideas and themes of the home, I thought was really great because it was both specific but broad enough for us all to find our own entry point into it. And so thinking about entry points, that's kind of exactly how I got to this concept. And I'm more focused on the idea of leaving home or leaving your comfort zone, the things that we take with us, memory, baggage, gifts and blessings, and the idea of how we're changed upon coming back to where we started.
So it sounds like it's a bit of a journey in this room. Can you tell us how the visitor should be approaching this space, or how you'd like to see them move through this space?
Yeah, absolutely. So, it was brought to my attention that this is kind of uniquely a space that you have to traverse through twice to see the whole show. And so I really was thinking about the idea of the viewer, as they walk through the space once, they would experience it from one angle, and on their way out of the show, they would experience the space from another angle. So everyone is kind of participating and kind of helping me perform this idea of leaving your comfort zone, crossing the threshold, and then coming back to your point of origin.
Oh, that's nice. So one thing that we loved so much about your work when we first started talking to artists was your use of materials. And it seems like in this installation, materials are really at the core of that journey that you're talking about. Can you talk a little bit more about the specific materials you've used?
Yeah, absolutely. So, so one thing that, myself and peers talk about often is this idea that the found object is kind of subjected to the same human condition and experience as all of us. And so, you start to think about like scars and wounds and, those kind of surface gestures that tell a narrative, and so people in the same way kind of have those same gestures that may explain some of their life experience. And I think these found objects carry that same kind of aura, having lived a certain kind of life, or maybe have a bit of wisdom that I don't have because they've been around a lot longer than I have. So, on one hand, I'm trying to piece together this narrative that started before I was here and will continue after I'm gone, and make it make sense. And specifically the choice in the ballistics gelatin was, one, it's meant to emulate flesh. It's meant to emulate human flesh. And, it's very visceral, literally violent in a lot of cases. But I'm still thinking about that material malleability, and how that aligns with a kind of human malleability and how we're changed through our experiences in the same way that materials and objects in our environment are too.
As they come through your installation, what do you hope a visitor takes away with them after being?
Yeah, I think it's it can be a bit tricky because on one hand, I want people to have a very organic kind of experience. I talk a lot about the rhizome with some peers of mine, and the rhizome is kind of this shape with many points of entry and many points of exit. So I want people to kind of organically have their own experience and bring their memories to this exhibit. But at the same time, I also kind of want, I guess the hope is that the installation is just subtly out in front of you enough that you'll notice the space has been changed, but I want it to transform and designate the space with that kind of interior and exterior with as little structure as possible, to really kind of lean on the idea of this as like a symbolic psychic space rather than like a literal space.
You've arranged the space in a really interesting way, where it, from my perspective at least, it seems that you both tell the viewer where to go, but also give options. How does that figure into your narrative?
Yeah. Again, it's, I guess the word is synchronicity, honestly. And, in the same way that some people say you can't sit two people down and say, now dialogue, you can't force a synchronicity. And so there's always this balancing act of trying to make objects that require that you meet them halfway, or designing a space that requires you meet it halfway, that you have some bit of like interest or investment to pay a little bit more attention than you would have otherwise. You know, essentially it's about made objects and the act of looking and engaging in this act of looking, and the made space, which is about the act of traversal and movement, and how those two play into one another.
So, sorry, I love that. Can you refer, painting?
Yes. Yeah. So like my usual work, the collage kind of assemblage stuff, I call them painting shaped objects. And, you know, paint isn't always involved as a medium, so they're shaped more like paintings. And so these made objects are about an exercise in looking, you know, like a lot of work is, but especially in that way that you meet them at the halfway point. And I was going for the same thing, this kind of made space that is about the act of movement, and how those two play together, the act of looking and the act of moving.
It's funny that you say the act of looking, because when I look at, when I move through your space, of course it's the visuals that capture me, but it's the textures too. Like you really have a real attention to texture in some of the sculptural objects. How do you work with texture in works like this, for example?
Yeah, so I pay a lot of close attention to what I and other people call a plasticity. Certain materials have a plasticity where you can really read the history. Certain materials, you know, they lend themselves to a patina and kind of holding on to those marks and, you know, gestures through time. So I really try to choose material that has that plasticity, has that surface memory, and holds on to gesture as well.
I'm also thinking about the process. We've been lucky to kind of follow you through this process. How did this actual physical space change or transform your process as you've been working on this? Yeah,
that's a great question. So I think in the painting shaped objects, as I call them, there's always been this attempt to have them engage with space and with the viewer. And honestly, installation is something that I've been wanting to try my hand at for a long time, because I feel like I've been, you know, kind of practicing some of the ideas and the notions, but it's the logical next step is that you would kind of design and change the space.
Yeah, that's perfect. There's another, now I have all these questions. The other thing that I noticed in this space is the use of light. Like I feel like you really played with the use of light between natural light and the artificial light. And how do you think about light in the movement through this space?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's funny. I think sometimes, you know, light has this connotation of always revealing things. But I think sometimes the truth is that there also exists like a synthetic light that sometimes is so bright that it drowns out all the detail. And so this kind of play of like natural light and synthetic light, I felt like was another way to kind of encapsulate the light and darkness kind of dichotomy, but instead this is the kind of the clarity of daylight versus the kind of like blindingness of, you know, artificial light. Yeah, and how that, you know, kind of guides our experience.
That's great. So we've also had lots of talks about books and articles, and I'm wondering, has there been any art or reading that's influenced you in this part of your installation? Yeah, absolutely.
There's one of my favorite films. I just brought it up today, actually. It's called Stalker by Andrei Tarkovsky, 1970s film. And this idea of zones, and the zone, I think, is very interesting. I kind of realized this parallel between kind of like the post-war environment, and I think a lot of neighborhoods that Pittsburgh has that are kind of, you know, in disrepair, or, you know, honestly, a lot of the people that live in these spaces don't have much agency or ownership over the space. And so it's funny that kind of potential energy that, you know, a neighborhood that doesn't have much, you know, resources, really parallels, I think, the state of a city kind of after a post-war moment. And so the zone is this idea of, you know, the unfamiliar, the kind of wilderness, but also this space where every step is uncertain. And, you know, the laws of reality, as you know, it could kind of dissolve in front of you. And And so that kind of really stuck with me, the idea of the zone from Stalker. And this, I think, is a great way to kind of illustrate the idea of embracing the zone or embracing the unknown, that kind of, call of the void or call to adventure, and what pulls us out of our familiar kind of, comfort spaces.
I love that. So you mentioned that you're Pittsburgh born and bred.
Mm-hmm.
So what is home to you? Is Pittsburgh home to you, or how do you imagine your home?
That's a great question. Pittsburgh is definitely home. And it, especially in the past few years, I've seen, there are a lot of transient people, like a lot of cities that are on their way, up or, in flux, but lots of transient people who are here for work, came here for school, their profession. And so it's really funny that I think we all kind of battle with this idea of like, kind of being critical of our home, our hometown, the place that we come from. And as I've gotten older, I've really started to recognize the kind of space that Pittsburgh is, kind of the intersection, the confluence of a lot of these really unique experiences and histories. So although I'd like to leave Pittsburgh and spend more time outside of the city, it is mostly about the idea of gathering resources and experiences and bringing them back here with me. And, very honestly and candidly, I hope that this also serves as a springboard for me to also perform that kind of call to adventure, that leaving home, and the return back to the point of origin.
I love that.
Yeah.
So I think there's a family picture that you've included in the, so where does family play into this particular installation or in your work in general? Yeah,
so I do think it's important, and I battle a lot with the idea of the work versus the person, and the distance between them, how much they should, mesh with one another. And the truth is that I find and learn much more about myself when I kind of recognize it in the work later, and it surprises me, versus, me pouring myself into the work is kind of the content and the focus. So the family photograph I have is of my brother and my sister as a baby, and it's behind the corrugated glass that really obscures it. So for me, it was the idea of family, the idea of a photograph, a memento, but kind of separating it from myself, me as an individual, and really trying to take my personal experience and scale it up to this transpersonal experience, Yeah.
So can I ask you about the title? I love the title GoodBones. Where did you get the title, and what does it mean? Yeah, so GoodBones, and especially lately, I've been thinking a lot about sayings, catchphrases, and kind of the dual nature that those can have often. So GoodBones, is a phrase that addresses the structure of a building, the quality of its frame, and essentially how good of an investment it would be for someone to buy it and fix it up, or, and so I kind of found this duality between the idea of good bones and, a structure, and the self as a structure as well. And, good bones can, it kind of has this suggestion of accessibility and movement, but the truth is that we often don't have to physically move in order for us to experience this kind of transformative journey. So GoodBones is kind of my way of acknowledging, that no matter the way you move or how far you're able to go, forward is a temporal thing. And that experience and moving forward through time is often enough for us to go far. I love that. Yeah, thank you. I want to talk, sorry, I know we're going a little long, but I just wanted to also ask, what was the experience of working with the other artists on this theme? Everybody's perspective is so different. Yeah. But how did that influence your process? Yeah, so that's a great question. On one hand, I saw a lot of parallels and similarities between myself and how the other artists approach the show. And I think it's natural to kind of have that gut reaction to want to separate yourself. But I think those similarities are especially important because we all have those unique, specific things that we can bring to it. But I really am most interested in the transpersonal and the kind of collective memory and collective experience.
So hearing everyone else's kind of understanding of home both kind of reaffirmed some of the things that I wanted to do, but then also helped me to recognize those ideas and parts of the home that maybe weren't being engaged with and people weren't interacting with. And that's how I got especially to the idea of leaving home and the space and the zone outside of the home.
I love that.
Yeah.
So this is a strange question, but I'm going to ask you to think about what would be a question you would pose to a person coming in here. So I've asked you a ton of questions, and what would you ask somebody to consider?
What in this made space reminds them of the space outside? What reminds them of the spaces that they're used to walking through, whether it's an alleyway or a park, or sitting on their back porch. And I guess this may be getting ahead of your final question, but in a very simple way, that's really what I'm aiming for, is this kind of exercise in looking and paying attention in a way that you hadn't before, so that when you leave the gallery space or, you know, the exhibition space, you kind of have that same eye to notice the things that you would have discounted or not recognized before.